Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Anne, your host, and I'm so glad you've tuned in today. This is WordWise, the podcast where we explore the fascinating world of language, communication, and culture. Today, we have a truly special guest with us, linguist, author, and professor of English Studies, William Max. Welcome to the show, William.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's a genuine pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time.
As have I. Now, William, let's dive straight in. The topic today is one that I think a lot of our listeners have wondered about at some point, the differences between British and American English. And I want to start with the big picture. Are these actually two different languages, or are they simply two dialects of the same language?
That's a wonderful opening question, and it's one that linguists have debated for decades. The short answer is that they are dialects, two major varieties of the same language. But the more nuanced answer is that the gap between them is, in some ways, more significant than the gap between certain languages that are officially classified as separate. There is mutual intelligibility, certainly, but the differences in vocabulary, spelling, pronunciation, grammar, and even cultural connotation are substantial enough that misunderstandings are not only possible, they are quite common.
Give us a sense of how deep those misunderstandings can go. We're not just talking about the occasional mispronounced word, are we?
Not at all. I always love to begin with vocabulary because it's where the differences are most immediately visible and most frequently amusing. Consider something as simple as the word biscuit. In British English, a biscuit is what Americans would call a cookie, a sweet, baked, often crunchy treat. But in American English, a biscuit is a soft, fluffy, bread-like roll that you might have at breakfast with butter or gravy. So if a British person visiting America orders biscuits at a diner expecting something sweet to go with their tea, they are in for quite a surprise.
That's such a great example. It's the same word, but it refers to completely different foods.
And food is a particularly rich area for these kinds of divergences. The British call the Underground Railway the Tube, or the Underground. Americans call it the Subway. The British say crisps for what Americans call chips, and the British say chips for what Americans call French fries. The British say aubergine, a word borrowed from French, for what Americans simply call eggplant. Courgette in Britain is zucchini in America. Rocket in a British salad is arugula on an American menu. The list is remarkably long.
It's extraordinary when you stack them up like that. Now, beyond food, where else do we see these kinds of vocabulary divergences?
Everywhere, really. Clothing is another very fertile ground. Americans wear pants as their primary lower body garment. In Britain, pants refers to underwear, specifically underpants. So an American saying, "I love your pants," to a British person is going to receive a very different reaction than intended. What Americans call pants, the British call trousers. Americans say sneakers for casual athletic shoes. The British say trainers. Americans say sweater. The British say jumper. Americans have bangs, the fringe of hair across the forehead, while the British simply call that a fringe.
And what about the world of driving and cars? I feel like there are quite a few differences there as well.
Absolutely. The front storage area of a car, Americans call it the hood. The British call it the bonnet. The rear storage area, Americans say trunk, the British say boot. Americans stop at a gas station to fill up with gas. The British stop at a petrol station to fill up with petrol. Americans drive on highways or freeways. The British drive on motorways. When you want to park temporarily, Americans use a parking lot. The British use a car park. Even traffic infrastructure has different names. The British use roundabouts extensively, and Americans sometimes call them traffic circles or rotaries, though they are far less common in the United States.
Let's move on to spelling, because I think that's something our listeners interact with on a daily basis, especially those who are writing professionally or academically. How did British and American spelling diverge so significantly?
The history here is fascinating, and it really comes down to one man, Noah Webster. He was an American lexicographer, a dictionary maker, working in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Webster believed passionately that the new American nation should have its own linguistic identity, distinct from Britain. He saw spelling reform as part of that project, so he made systematic changes. Words that ended in OUR in British English, color, honor, flavor, behavior, Webster simplified to OR, color, honor, flavor, behavior. Words ending in RE in British English, theater, center, fiber, he reversed to RE, theater, center, fiber.
So it was a deliberate, ideological act of linguistic independence.
Precisely. It was tied up with national identity, with the revolutionary spirit of the time. Webster wanted Americans to feel that their language was their own. He also changed the doubling of consonants in certain words. The British traveling and modeling became traveling and modeling in American English. Words like defense and offense in Britain became defense and offense in America. License as a noun in Britain is license in America, though interestingly, in Britain, license is used as the verb. So I need to license my vehicle, but I need my driving license. That particular distinction trips up a great many people.
It trips me up, and I work with language every day. What about the IZE versus ISE debate? I see both used, and I'm never entirely sure which is which.
This is one of the most persistent points of confusion. In American English, words like recognize, organize, realize, and apologize are always spelled with IZE. In British English, both ISE and IZE spellings are acceptable for most of these words. Recognize and recognize are both considered correct British spelling. However, there is an important caveat. Some British words must always end in ISE regardless. Words like advertise, advise, surprise, comprise, revise, exercise. These are never spelled with IZE in any variety of English. The IZE form actually has a longer historical pedigree. It comes from Greek through Latin, so it's not as if the Americans invented it. Many British style guides, including that of Oxford University Press, actually prefer IZE.
That's something I did not know. Let's talk about grammar now, because I think that's where things get even more interesting and perhaps more contested. What are the key grammatical differences?
Grammar is a wonderful area because the differences here are more subtle, but in some ways more revealing of how deeply the two varieties have evolved. Let me start with the present perfect tense. In British English, speakers typically use the present perfect for actions that have a connection to the present moment. So a British person would say, "I've just eaten," or "Have you seen my keys?" using the present perfect. An American would very commonly say, "I just ate," or "Did you see my keys?" using the simple past instead. Both are grammatically coherent, but they reflect different intuitions about how the past connects with the present.
I've actually noticed that when I watch British television. The characters use have constructions much more frequently than I would naturally.
You have a good ear. Another significant grammatical difference is in collective nouns. In American English, collective nouns are always treated as singular. You would say, "The team is playing well," or "The government has announced its decision." In British English, collective nouns are treated as plural when the speaker is thinking of the individual members of the group. So a British person would naturally say, "The team are playing well," or "The government have announced their decision." Neither is illogical, they simply reflect different conceptual framings of what a collective entity is.
What about prepositions? I feel like there are some notable differences there as well.
Absolutely. Americans say they're on a team. The British say they're in a team. Americans say different from or sometimes different than. The British prefer different from or different to, though different than does appear in British English in some constructions. Americans say Monday through Friday. The British say Monday to Friday. Americans talk about something happening on the weekend. The British say at the weekend. Americans write someone. The British write to someone. These small prepositional differences are easy to overlook, but they accumulate and can affect how natural your writing sounds to native readers on either side of the Atlantic.
William, let's talk about pronunciation. This is perhaps the most immediately noticeable difference when you encounter a speaker from the other variety. What are the key features that distinguish British and American pronunciation?
Pronunciation is a vast topic because both British and American English contain enormous regional diversity within themselves. The accent of someone from Newcastle in the north of England sounds nothing like the accent of someone from Cornwall in the southwest, and the accent of someone from Boston sounds nothing like the accent of someone from Texas. But if we compare what linguists call received pronunciation, the prestige British accent associated with the BBC and formal education, against general American, the relatively neutral accent common across much of the American Midwest, we can identify some consistent differences. The most notable is what linguists call the rhotic distinction.
Can you explain what rhotic means for our listeners?
Certainly. A rhotic accent is one where the letter R is pronounced wherever it appears in a word, including after vowels and at the end of words. American English is rhotic. An American will fully pronounce the R in words like car, bird, butter, here, and world. Most standard British English is non-rhotic. The R is typically not pronounced unless it is followed by a vowel. So a British speaker says caw rather than car, bud rather than bird, butta rather than butter. This is one of the most immediately recognizable features distinguishing the two accents.
And there's also a difference in how certain vowels are pronounced, isn't there? I'm thinking of words like bath and dance.
Exactly right. This is called the bath-trap split. In Southern British English and in received pronunciation, words like bath, path, dance, chance, can't, laugh, and ask are pronounced with a long ah vowel, like the sound in father. In American English, these same words are pronounced with a short ah sound, the same vowel as in cat or trap. So while a British person says bath, an American says bath with a flat ah. Interestingly, in Northern England, in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Sheffield, the pronunciation is actually closer to the American model with the short ah.
That's a fascinating detail. Now, I want to touch on something that I think is increasingly relevant in the age of global media and the internet, and that's the question of influence. Are these two varieties converging, or are they actually growing further apart?
That is perhaps the most pressing sociolinguistic question regarding these two varieties right now. The honest answer is both, in different ways and at different levels. On the surface level, particularly in vocabulary, American English has had an enormous influence on British English through Hollywood films, American television, American music, and now American social media platforms. British young people routinely use Americanisms that would have been completely foreign to their parents' generation. Words like gotten, sidewalk, trash, math without the final S that British English traditionally uses, cell phone rather than mobile, and countless bits of American slang have entered British everyday speech.
Does that alarm British linguists? Is there a sense that British English is somehow diluted?
There is certainly a camp that views it with concern, and there is a long tradition of British commentators, journalists, writers, broadcasters, lamenting what they call the Americanization of British English. The BBC itself has, at various points in its history, tried to enforce certain British usage standards. But most linguists take a more dispassionate view. Language change is natural and inevitable. The borrowing of vocabulary between varieties is a sign of living, evolving languages in contact with each other, not a sign of corruption or decay. And importantly, the influence is not unidirectional. American English has also absorbed British terms, particularly through British cultural exports. Football, as a term for what Americans call soccer, has become more common in America. British slang like bloody, cheers, used as a casual farewell, and gobsmacked have found their way into American usage.
Does that alarm British linguists? Is there a sense that British English is somehow diluted?
There is certainly a camp that views it with concern, and there is a long tradition of British commentators, journalists, writers, broadcasters, lamenting what they call the Americanization of British English. The BBC itself has, at various points in its history, tried to enforce certain British usage standards. But most linguists take a more dispassionate view. Language change is natural and inevitable. The borrowing of vocabulary between varieties is a sign of living, evolving languages in contact with each other, not a sign of corruption or decay. And importantly, the influence is not unidirectional. American English has also absorbed British terms, particularly through British cultural exports. Football, as a term for what Americans call soccer, has become more common in America. British slang like bloody, cheers, used as a casual farewell, and gobsmacked have found their way into American usage.
Does that alarm British linguists? Is there a sense that British English is somehow diluted?
There is certainly a camp that views it with concern, and there is a long tradition of British commentators, journalists, writers, broadcasters, lamenting what they call the Americanization of British English. The BBC itself has, at various points in its history, tried to enforce certain British usage standards. But most linguists take a more dispassionate view. Language change is natural and inevitable. The borrowing of vocabulary between varieties is a sign of living, evolving languages in contact with each other, not a sign of corruption or decay. And importantly, the influence is not unidirectional. American English has also absorbed British terms, particularly through British cultural exports. Football, as a term for what Americans call soccer, has become more common in America. British slang like bloody, cheers, used as a casual farewell, and gobsmacked have found their way into American usage.
What about at the level of grammar and pronunciation? Is convergence happening there too?
Much more slowly, if at all. Grammar changes over centuries, not decades. The present perfect usage, the collective noun treatment, the preposition preferences, these remain largely stable and distinct. Pronunciation is somewhere in between. Certain phonological features of spreading, the intrusive R, for example, or the rising of certain vowels, but the fundamental rhotic distinction and the vowel differences remain robust. If anything, some linguists argue that at the phonological level, the two varieties have actually been diverging rather than converging over the last century, with each developing its own internal sound changes that move in different directions.
William, before we wrap up, I want to ask you something that I think our listeners will find very practical. For someone who's writing in English, perhaps they're a student, a professional, someone writing for a global audience, how do they navigate these two varieties? Is there a right answer?
The right answer is consistency and awareness. The single most important rule is to pick one variety and stick to it throughout a document or piece of writing. Mixing color and color in the same document, or using both organization and organization, creates an impression of carelessness that undermines the writer's credibility. Beyond that, consider your audience. If you are writing for a primarily British readership, use British conventions. If you're writing for an American audience, use American conventions. If you're writing for a truly global audience, as many academics and international business writers are, then either variety is acceptable, but American English is statistically more prevalent globally, largely due to American economic and cultural dominance, and so American spelling and usage may be slightly more universally recognized.
That's very practical advice. And what would you say to someone learning English as a second or foreign language? Which variety should they learn?
This is a question I'm asked constantly, and my answer is always the same. Learn whichever variety you will actually use. If you're in a country where the educational system teaches British English, or if you're likely to work in a British or Commonwealth context, learn British English. If you're likely to interact primarily with Americans or consume primarily American media, learn American English. The important thing is not which variety you choose, but that you develop a deep intuitive feel for it, a sensitivity to its rhythms, its connotations, its idioms. And then build your awareness of the other variety so that when you encounter it, you're not confused. Linguistic flexibility is an enormous professional and social asset.
Beautifully put. William, this has been such a rich and illuminating conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. We could have an entire series just on this topic.
We absolutely could. There are whole dimensions we haven't touched. The question of regional accents within each country, the role of literature in shaping linguistic norms, and the fascinating history of English as it spread around the world and gave rise to Australian English, Canadian English, Indian English, South African English, each with their own distinct features. Language is inexhaustible as a subject, which is part of why I have devoted my life to it.
And we are all richer for it. William Max, thank you so much for joining us today on WordWise. This has genuinely been one of my favorite conversations on the show.
The pleasure has been entirely mine, and thank you for such thoughtful and well-prepared questions. And to your listeners, keep paying attention to language. It will reward you endlessly.
That is wonderful advice to end on. Thank you all for listening to WordWise. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with anyone who loves language as much as we do. Until next time, keep your words precise, your curiosity wide, and your ears open.